The year was 1887, and the value of a human life in the Dakota Territory was often less than a good saddle horse. But when the gavel slammed down in the smoky, whiskey-soaked air of the Deadwood auction house, the silence that followed was deafening. 4 sisters bound not by ropes, but by the cruel debt of their own blood. Relative stood trembling on the block. The crowd jeered, expecting a cheap sale for domestic labor, or worse. Then the heavy double doors groaned open. A shadow fell across the room, carrying the scent of gunpowder and cold rain. It was Garrett Cole, a man rumored to have a heart made of iron and a graveyard in his backyard. He didn't just bid, he declared a war. What happened next wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a legend that would change the map of the West forever. The air inside the Gilded Horn Saloon was thick enough to chew. It smelled of unwashed bodies, stale beer, and the copper tang of desperation. In the center of the room, on a makeshift wooden stage, usually reserved for can-can dancers, stood the 4 distinct reasons for the crowd's sudden attentiveness. Tobias Reed, a man with a face like a crumpled paper bag, and eyes that darted like a cornered rat, stood beside them. He wiped his sweating forehead with a rag that had once been white. "Gentlemen," Tobias stammered, his voice cracking, "I present to you the finest help a man could ask for, my brother's daughters, hard workers, clean, obedient." A low rumble of laughter moved through the crowd of miners, drifters, and cattle hands. They weren't looking at the girls for their cleaning skills. Sarah, the eldest at 20, stood at the front. Her chin was held high, though her hands shook violently where they gripped her skirt. She was the shield. Behind her stood 17-year-old Emily, whose eyes burned with a fire that promised violence to anyone who touched her. Behind Emily was 14-year-old Martha, weeping silently and clutching the hand of 6-year-old Grace, who was too young to understand the transaction, but old enough to feel the terror radiating from her sisters. "Do I hear $50 for the lot?" the auctioneer. A greasy man named Pendergrass shouted. He banged a gavel that looked like a meat tenderizer. "50, shouted a toothless prospector near the front. "I need a cook and a warmer." The crowd erupted in laughter. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. Tobias refused to look at her. He was staring at the bottle of whiskey on the bar, already mentally spending the money he would get for selling his own flesh and blood to pay off a gambling debt to the local crime boss, a man known only as the Butcher. 70, another voice cried out. A well-dressed man in a suit that cost more than the saloon, a brothel owner from up north. The bidding war began dirty and fast. The sisters watched as their lives were haggled over like cattle. Emily leaned forward, whispering into Sarah's ear. "If they separate us, I run. I run and I come back, and I kill Tobias." "Hush," Sarah hissed, though her heart agreed. "Stay behind me." The price had reached $300. The brothel owner was winning. Tobias looked giddy. He was going to clear his debt and have money left over for another hand of poker. Then the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The batwing doors at the entrance didn't just swing open. They were kicked with a force that rattled the hinges. The noise of the saloon died instantly. Even the piano player froze his fingers, hovering over the keys. Standing in the doorway was a mountain of a man. He wore a duster coat stained with the red dust of the Badlands and the dark oil of gun maintenance. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but everyone knew the jawline. It was a jaw set in perpetual granite. Garrett Cole. Stories about Cole were common currency in the territory. They said he was a rancher who owned 10,000 acres of the most hostile land in the territory. They said he lost his wife and child 5 years ago and hadn't spoken a kind word since. They said he shot a man for mistreating a horse and left the body for the buzzards. Garrett walked to the center of the room. The crowd parted like water. The sound of his spurs, heavy silver Mexican spurs, rang out in the silence. Chink, chink, Chink. He stopped 10 feet from the stage. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked straight at Tobias Reed. Tobias turned a pale shade of grey. "Mr. Cole, I didn't know you were in town." "I'm not." Garrett's voice was a deep gravel grinding and low. "I'm passing through, and I see a man selling his brother's children." It's hard times, Garrett," Tobias whined. "Debts to pay. The girls. They need a home. I can't feed 'em, so you sell them to a pimp." Garrett gestured vaguely at the well-dressed bidder, who suddenly found his shoes very interesting. "I bid 300, the brothel owner squeaked, trying to regain his dignity. Garrett didn't even turn his head. He reached into his duster and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it. It flew through the air and landed with a heavy metallic thud at Tobias's feet. The sound of gold coins clinking together was unmistakable. 5,000, Garrett said. The room gasped. $5,000 was a fortune. It was enough to buy the saloon, the land it sat on, and the mayor's house. Tobias's eyes bulged. He scrambled for the bag, tearing it open. Gold double eagles spilled out. "Done sold. They're yours, Mr. Cole, all yours." Garrett stepped up to the stage. He towered over Sarah. Up close she saw the scars on his face, thin white lines running into his beard. His eyes were not the eyes of a monster, though. They were the eyes of a man who had been looking at a long, dark tunnel for years. They were exhausted. "Get in the wagon outside," Garrett ordered. He didn't smile. He didn't leer. He sounded like a man ordering supplies. "We won't go with you," Emily snapped, stepping out from behind Sarah. "We aren't cattle." Garrett looked at the 17-year-old. For a second, a flicker of something amusement, respect, crossed his face. "You can stay here with your uncle and the man in the silk suit," Garrett said calmly. "Or you can get in the wagon." Sarah grabbed Emily's arm. She looked at Tobias, who was already drinking a fresh bottle of whiskey, ignoring them completely. She looked at Garrett Cole. He was terrifying, yes. But there was a strange void in him, a lack of the predatory hunger the other men showed. "Come on," Sarah whispered. She led her sisters off the stage. As they walked past Garrett, he turned to Tobias. "One more thing," Garrett said. Tobias looked up, grinning. "Yes, sir. Anything for you, Mr. Cole." "If I ever see you within 50 miles of my land," Garrett said, his voice carrying to the back of the room, "I will nail your hide to my barn door." Tobias's smile vanished. Garrett turned and followed the girls out into the cold night. The journey to the Cole ranch took 3 days. They were 3 days of biting wind and oppressive silence. Garrett drove the buckboard wagon with expert ease. He had purchased heavy wool blankets and buffalo robes before they left town, throwing them into the back where the girls huddled. He also tossed them a sack of Apple's dried beef and a canteen of water. He never spoke unless necessary. "Camp here, or storm coming." The sisters created a fortress of whispers in the back of the wagon. "He's fattening us up," Martha whispered, shivering under a buffalo robe. "Like Hansel and Gretel." "He hasn't looked at us once," Sarah countered, keeping a protective arm around Grace. "Men who want to hurt you. They look, they stare. He looks at the horizon." "Maybe he wants slaves," Emily muttered, glaring at Garrett's broad back. "Someone to work his fields until they drop." "Better than the brothel," Sarah said grimly. On the evening of the 3rd day, the terrain changed. The flat plains gave way to jagged foothills and towering pines. The air grew thinner and colder. They passed under a massive timber archway. Burned into the wood were the words Iron Ridge. The ranch was not what they expected. Given the money Garrett had thrown around, Sarah expected a mansion. Instead, they saw a sprawling, chaotic functionalism. There were massive barns, sturdy corrals holding magnificent horses, and miles of well-maintained fencing. But the main house, the place where the master lived, was a dark, brooding structure of timber and stone that looked half-finished. Garrett pulled the horses to a halt in front of the house. A few ranch hands, rough-looking men with scars and quiet demeanors, stopped their work to watch. They didn't hoot or holler. They just watched with a strange mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Get down," Garrett said, jumping off the seat. The girls climbed down their legs, stiff. The wind here was fierce, howling down from the snowy peaks. "Hank!" Garrett yelled. An older man with a limp and a white beard hobbled over from the stables. "Boss, you buy them supplies. Bought more than that," Garrett grunted. "These are the Reed girls. They live here now." Hank's jaw dropped. He looked from Garrett to the 4 terrified girls. "Live here, boss. This ain't a place for... look at 'em." "Put their things in the east wing," Garrett ordered, ignoring the protest. "Get the stove running in there. It hasn't been used in years." "The east wing," Hank whispered, his eyes widening. "You haven't opened the east wing since she passed." "Do it," Garrett snapped. The anger in his voice was like a whip crack. Garrett turned to the sisters. He loomed over them, blotting out the setting sun. "Rules," he stated. 1, you stay out of my room. 2, you pull your weight. Everyone works on Iron Ridge. 3, you don't go near the canyon ridge after dark. Wolves." "What kind of work?" Sarah asked, finding her voice. Garrett looked at her hands, soft city hands. "We'll find something. For now, Hank will show you to your rooms. Dinner is at sundown. If you're late, you don't eat." He turned on his heel and stomped up the stairs, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. "Welcome to hell," Emily muttered. But Hank, the old man, looked at them with a sudden heart-breaking softness. "Don't mind him, missus. He barks loud so he don't have to feel nothing. Come on. Let's get you out of the cold." The east wing was dusty, covered in white sheets that looked like ghosts in the moonlight. But underneath the dust, the furniture was exquisite. There were mahogany dressers, a rocking horse, a sewing machine, and beds with mattresses made of goose down. "This was for his family?" Sarah asked Hank as he lit the pot-belly stove in the hallway. Hank nodded solemnly. "Wife and a little girl. Died 5 years ago. Winter fever. Boss couldn't get the doctor out here in time. Snow was 10 feet deep. He blamed the road, blamed the horse, mostly blamed himself." Sarah looked around the room. It wasn't a prison. It was a mausoleum, a shrine to a dead life, and they were the intruders waking it up. The first month was a war of attrition. Garrett was a phantom. He left before dawn and returned after dark, smelling of sweat and horses. He ate his meals at the head of the long table, staring at his plate, eating quickly and leaving. The girls, however, were not idle. Survival instinct kicked in. Sarah took over the kitchen. The ranch cook, a man named Cookie, ironically terrible at baking, was happy to hand over the apron. Sarah discovered that Garrett had a cellar full of expensive ingredients he never touched: sacks of fine flour, preserved peaches, spices from the east. She began to cook. Real food, roasts with rosemary, fresh bread, apple pies. The first time Sarah put a slice of warm apple pie in front of Garrett, he stared at it for a full minute. The ranch hands at the other end of the table went silent. Garrett took a bite. He chewed slowly. He didn't say thank you. But that night, he didn't slam his door. Emily, the feisty one, refused to stay indoors. She found her way to the stables. She had a natural gift with animals that rivaled the seasoned hands. She found a wild black stallion that had been deemed unbreakable and was scheduled to be sold for meat. Emily spent 2 weeks sitting on the fence, just talking to the horse. Garrett watched her one evening from the porch, smoking a cigar. His eyes narrowed. He didn't stop her. By week 3, Emily was riding the stallion. When Garrett saw her galloping across the lower pasture, her hair flying like a banner behind her, he walked out to the fence. "He pulls to the left," Garrett shouted as she rode by. Emily pulled the stallion up, breathless. "What?" "The horse. He has a stiff shoulder. He pulls to the left. Compensate with your knee." It was the first constructive sentence he had spoken to her. Emily adjusted her grip, nudged the horse, and he ran straighter. She looked back at Garrett. He gave a single curt nod and walked away. Martha and Grace, meanwhile, found the library. It was a dusty room filled with books on engineering history and law. Martha began to read to Grace. Then she began to organize. She found Garrett's ledgers, a mess of papers shoved into a desk. Martha, possessed of a sharp mathematical mind, began to balance the books. She found errors, suppliers overcharging, wool sold for too little. One evening, Garrett came home to find Martha sitting at his desk, buried in his papers. He froze in the doorway, his face darkening. "I said stay out of my room." "This is the study," Martha said, her voice shaking but her finger pointing to a ledger. "Not your bedroom. And you're being robbed." Garrett stomped over. "What?" "The feed supplier in Billings. He's charging you for grade A oats and delivering a mix of grade C and sawdust. I checked the inventory against the receipts. You've lost $400 this quarter." Garrett leaned down, smelling of leather and rain. He looked at the numbers. He traced Martha's neat handwriting. He looked at the 14-year-old girl who was trembling but holding her ground. "Write a letter," Garrett growled. "Tell him I'm coming to see him on Monday, and tell him to have my refund ready." "Yes, sir," Martha whispered. "And Martha, yes. You have good handwriting. Keep the books from now on." The dynamic was shifting. The sisters were no longer guests or prisoners. They were becoming the gears that made Iron Ridge turn. But the trauma of their past was not gone. Was not gone. One night, a group of drunks from town rode up to the property line. They had heard about the harem Garrett Cole had bought. They sat on their horses, waving whiskey bottles, shouting obscenities toward the house, calling out Sarah's name. Inside, the girls huddled in the kitchen, terrified. The memories of the auction block came rushing back. Garrett was eating stew. He didn't look up until a rock smashed through the front window, shattering glass across the floor. Grace screamed. Garrett set his spoon down. The sound was quiet, but it signaled the end of the world. He stood up, walked to the gun rack by the door, and took down a Winchester repeater. He checked the action. "Stay here," he told Sarah. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was cold. Deadly cold. He walked out onto the porch. "Hey, Cole," one of the drunks shouted. "Share the wealth, old man." Garrett didn't speak. He raised the rifle and fired. Crack the hat flew off the head of the lead rider. The men screamed, horses rearing. "The next one takes your ear," Garrett called out. "The one after that takes your head." "We're just having fun," the man yelled. Garrett levered the rifle. Clack, clack. "My property line is 50 yards back," Garrett said. "You're trespassing. I don't fire warning shots twice." The riders scrambled, turning their horses and galloping into the darkness. Garrett stood on the porch for a long time, watching the dark. When he came back inside, he saw the girls staring at him, not with fear of him, but with something else. Awe. He looked at the shattered window. "I'll fix the glass in the morning," he muttered. He looked at Sarah. Stew was good. That night, for the first time in 5 years, the wind didn't sound so lonely around Iron Ridge. But the peace was fragile. The past has a way of not staying buried, and Tobias Reed had not gone far. Winter in the Dakota Territory was a living thing, a white beast that swallowed the world whole. But inside the main house of Iron Ridge, for the first time in half a decade, there was warmth that didn't just come from the stove. Sarah had begun to change the very atmosphere of the house. She didn't just cook. She mended the curtains, She polished the tarnished silver, and she placed jars of dried wildflowers on the mantel right next to the framed photograph of Garrett's late wife, Mary. One evening a blizzard trapped them all inside. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the heavy timber beams. Garrett was sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar wood. He had been working on it for weeks, though he hid it whenever anyone entered the room. Little Grace, bold with the ignorance of youth, walked up to him. "What are you making?" she asked. Sarah froze from across the room, where she was darning socks. She waited for the explosion. Garrett didn't like to be disturbed. Garrett stopped whittling. He looked down at the 6-year-old. "A wolf," he rumbled. "Is it a bad wolf?" Grace asked. "No," Garrett said softly. "It's a guardian. Wolves protect their pack." He blew the shavings off the wood and handed it to her. It was a crude but powerful carving of a sitting wolf. Grace gasped, clutching it to her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett." "Garrett," he corrected her. "Just Garrett." He looked up and locked eyes with Sarah. In the firelight, the hard lines of his face seemed softer. There was a question in his eyes, a vulnerability that terrified him. Sarah offered a tentative smile. For the first time, he didn't look away. But the peace was a fragile illusion. 2 weeks later, the snow began to melt, turning the roads into rivers of slush. With the thaw came visitors. It was a Tuesday when the black carriage arrived, flanked by 4 armed riders. It wasn't the drunken louts from before. These men wore badges. Garrett was in the corral with Emily watching her work the black stallion. He saw the carriage and his posture stiffened. "Get inside," he told Emily. "Take your sisters to the cellar. Don't come out until I say." "Garrett?" Emily asked, sensing the danger. "Go," he roared. As the girls ran to the house, the carriage stopped. A man stepped out. He was tall, thin, and wore a suit that was too clean for the frontier. He carried a briefcase. Behind him, looking smug and wearing a new coat, was Tobias Reed. Garrett walked to the gate, his hand resting near the Colt peacemaker on his hip. "Get off my land, Tobias," Garrett said. "I told you the price of returning." Now, Mr. Cole," the thin man said, stepping forward. He had a voice like oil on water. "No need for threats. I am attorney Phineas Galt. I represent Mr. Reed." "He sold them," Garrett said. "I have witnesses." "Ah," Galt smiled, revealing yellow teeth. "A transaction made under duress. My client was intoxicated and manipulated by a man of your imposing reputation. Furthermore, under the territorial statutes of 1887, the sale of guardianship rights without a magistrate's approval is null and void. Legally, those girls still belong to Mr. Reed." Garrett laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "He doesn't want them. He wants money. He wants his family," Galt lied smoothly. "Or perhaps a settlement, a significant one, to compensate for the emotional distress." "How much?" Garrett asked, his voice low. 10,000, Tobias shouted from behind the lawyer. "And the black stallion?" Garrett looked at Tobias. "I paid 5,000. That was charity. I won't pay a penny more." "Then we have a court order," Galt said, pulling a paper from his coat. It bore the signature of Judge Archibald Crane, a man known throughout the territory for being bought with whiskey and women. "Sheriff Barton here is authorized to retrieve the minors." The sheriff, a heavy-set man with a red face, who had been avoiding Garrett's eyes, stepped forward. "Sorry, Garrett. It's the law. Hand 'em over." Garrett drew his gun. The movement was a blur. Suddenly the sheriff was staring down the barrel of a .45. The 4 deputies behind him reached for their weapons, but Garrett's voice stopped them. "I will kill the first man who touches a weapon," Garrett said, "and then I will kill the lawyer." "You can't fight the United States government." "Cole!" Galt shrieked, hiding behind the carriage door. "I'm not fighting the government," Garrett said. "I'm fighting kidnappers. Now get out!" It was a standoff. The sheriff knew Garrett's reputation. He knew Garrett wouldn't miss. "We'll be back," The sheriff grunted, raising his hands. "With a warrant and a posse. You're making a mistake, Cole." "The mistake was coming here," Garrett replied. They retreated. But as the carriage rolled away, Tobias leaned out the window. "I'll burn this place to the ground. Cole, I'll take them back and sell them to the mines. You hear me?" Garrett watched them go. His hand was shaking, not from fear, but from rage. He turned to the house. Sarah was standing on the porch. She had heard everything. "They're coming back," she whispered. "I know," Garrett said. He looked at the vast expanse of Iron Ridge. "Pack your things. Not clothes, just the essentials. We're going to the canyon." "The canyon?" Sarah asked. "Why?" "Because Garrett said Iron Ridge isn't just a ranch. It's a fortress. But I can't defend the house. I can defend the pass." The canyon was a narrow gorge at the northern edge of the property, leading up to the high caves where the Apache used to winter. It was a natural choke point. For 2 days, Garrett and the sisters prepared. This was where the history began to be written. It wasn't just a man protecting girls. It was a unit working together. Martha, with her mind for logistics, organized the supplies. She calculated how much water and ammunition they would need for a week-long siege. Emily scouted the perimeter on the Black Stallion, reporting back on the sheriff's movements. Sarah prepared bandages and food, and she kept Grace calm. Garrett spent the time teaching them. He didn't treat them like fragile dolls anymore. "Hold it like this," he told Sarah, placing a Winchester rifle in her hands. "Don't close your eyes when you pull the trigger. Kickback will bruise your shoulder. But if you hold it tight, you'll be fine." "I don't want to shoot anyone," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "You shoot to stop them," Garrett said intensely. "You shoot the ground in front of them. You shoot their horses. But if they try to touch Grace, you shoot to kill." "Do you understand?" Sarah looked at Grace, who was playing with the wooden wolf. Her expression hardened. "I understand." On the 3rd day, the posse arrived. It wasn't just the sheriff and his deputies. Tobias had recruited 20 hired guns mercenaries from the railway camps. They rode up the valley like a storm cloud. Garrett stood at the mouth of the pass, behind a barricade of fallen logs. He was alone. The girls were hidden 50 yards back in the rocks, instructed to stay down unless he fell. "Last chance, Cole," Sheriff Barton yelled from the bottom of the slope. "Send the girls down. Come and get them." Garrett's voice echoed off the canyon walls. The gunfire started instantly. Bullets chipped the stone around Garrett's head. He returned fire, calm and methodical. Every time his rifle cracked, a mercenary scrambled for cover. He wasn't shooting to kill, not yet. He was shooting to pin them down. But there were too many of them. They began to flank, climbing the scree slopes on either side of the pass. "Emily!" Garrett shouted without looking back. "The East Ridge. They're coming up the goat path." Emily didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the rocks, not with a gun, but with a landslide Garrett had rigged. She pulled the rope. A net of heavy boulders broke loose, tumbling down the East Ridge. The mercenaries climbing that side screamed as the rocks crashed around them, forcing them to retreat. "Good girl!" Garrett yelled. But on the west side, 3 men had made it past the perimeter. They were circling behind Garrett. Sarah saw them. She was hiding in a crevice with Grace and Martha. The men were creeping toward Garrett's exposed back. Sarah picked up the Winchester. Her hands were sweating. She remembered Garrett's words. "If they try to touch Grace." She stepped out of cover. "Hey!" she screamed. The 3 men turned. One of them, a scarred brute named Pike, grinned. "Well, looky here. The prize." He raised his pistol toward Sarah. Sarah didn't close her eyes. She pulled the trigger. The bullet didn't hit Pike. It hit the rock right next to his ear, sending a spray of stone shrapnel into his face. He howled, dropping his gun and clutching his eyes. The distraction was enough. Garrett spun around, seeing the threat. He fanned the hammer of his revolver. Bang! Bang! 2 men went down with leg wounds. Pike, blinded by dust, stumbled and fell down the slope. The shooting stopped. The posse regrouped at the bottom of the hill. They had underestimated the family. "They're digging in," Garrett said, breathing hard as he reloaded. He looked at Sarah. She was pale, shaking, but standing tall. "You saved my life," Garrett said. "I missed," Sarah whispered. "You hit exactly what you needed to," he replied. He reached out and squeezed her hand. For a moment, amidst the smell of gunpowder, there was silence. But the night was coming, and with it a new danger. Tobias wasn't going to give up. He knew they couldn't hold out forever. That night, under the cover of darkness, Tobias tried a coward's move. He didn't attack the pass. He set fire to the scrub brush at the base of the canyon. The wind was blowing up the gorge. Smoke began to fill the air. Thick, choking smoke. "He's smoking us out." Martha coughed, hugging Grace. Garrett looked at the fire. It was growing fast. They couldn't stay. If they ran up the canyon, they'd be trapped in a box canyon with no exit. If they went down, they'd be shot. "We need a miracle," Emily said. "No." Garrett set his eyes hard. "We need the governor." "The governor?" Sarah asked. "He's in Bismarck. That's days away." "No," Garrett said. "Governor Lewis Church is inspecting the railway line in Deadwood today. I saw the notice in the paper Martha was reading." "Deadwood is 20 miles away," Emily said. "And we're surrounded." Garrett looked at the black stallion tethered in the back of the cave. He looked at Emily. "Can you ride him bareback at night?" Emily's eyes widened. "Yes. There's a deer trail up the back of the canyon. It's steep. It's dangerous. But if you clear the ridge, it's open prairie to Deadwood." "I'll go," Emily said immediately. "If they see you, they'll shoot," Garrett warned. "They won't see me," Emily said, mounting the horse. "I'm the wind." She guided the horse up the treacherous, shifting shale of the back wall. Garrett and Sarah watched hearts in their throats. One slip meant death. At the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the moon, the horse reared silently. Then she was gone. The fire Tobias had lit at the base of the canyon didn't roar. It crept. It was a suffocating, silent malice that crawled up the gorge, consuming the oxygen and replacing it with acrid, blinding smoke. Inside the shallow cave, the heat was becoming a physical weight pressing against their chests. Garrett had moved the girls to the deepest recess of the rock overhang, soaking the last of their precious water into rags to cover their faces. "Stay low," he rasped, his voice ruined by the smoke. "Don't move until I tell you." He took his position at the mouth of the cave, the Winchester resting heavily across his knees. He checked his pocket. 5 rounds. He had 5 bullets left to hold off 20 men. He wasn't planning on surviving the morning, but he had made a silent pact with the Almighty. For every bullet he would buy the girls another 10 minutes of life. "Come out, Cole." Tobias's voice drifted up from the darkness, shrill and triumphant. "It's getting hot in there. Send the girls down, and maybe we'll let you die quick." Garrett didn't answer. He simply wiped the sweat from his eyes and stared down the barrel of the rifle. He had failed his wife and daughter in a storm of ice. He would not fail these girls in a storm of fire. Dawn broke not with glory, but with the color of a fresh bruise, purples and sickly yellows bleeding across the sky. The wind shifted, blowing the worst of the smoke away, but revealing their position clearly. The fire had burned itself out into a blackened, smoldering scar across the valley floor. The posse began to advance. They stepped over the charred scrub brush, their boots kicking up ash. They weren't hiding anymore. They knew Cole was cornered. They knew he was out of time. Garrett shouldered the rifle. He lined up his sights on the lead mercenary. His finger tightened on the trigger. Crack! The shot echoed, and the man's hat flew off. The mercenaries ducked, but they were laughing now. They knew it was a bluff. They began to run up the slope. Then a sound, cut through the morning air. It wasn't a gunshot. It was sharp, brassy, and impossible. It was a bugle call, piercing the silence of the canyon like a knife. Garrett froze. The mercenaries froze, looking toward the southern ridge. Thundering over the crest of the hill came a sight that stopped the breath in Garrett's throat. It was a wall of blue coats and flashing sabers. It wasn't just a sheriff's deputy. It was the United States Cavalry, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that turned gold in the rising sun. And leading them riding alongside the standard-bearer, on a horse that looked as exhausted as she was Emily. Her dress was torn, her face was streaked with mud and soot, but she sat tall in the saddle, pointing a shaking finger toward the cave. Behind the soldiers bouncing violently in a carriage that had no business on such rough terrain was the governor of the Dakota Territory, himself Louis Church. The cavalry swept down the hill like a landslide. "Drop your weapons!" a captain roared, his voice booming over the sound of hooves. By order of the governor, drop them or be cut down. The mercenaries didn't hesitate. They threw their rifles into the mud, raising their hands in terrified surrender. The hired guns knew better than to fight the army. But Tobias Reed panicked. Seeing his victory turn to ash, he scrambled toward his horse, clawing at the saddle, desperate to flee. He never made it. Emily saw him. She didn't wait for the soldiers. She kicked her heels into the black stallion's flanks. The massive horse surged forward, cutting off Tobias's escape. As Tobias turned to run, the stallion shouldered him, knocking the man flat into the mud. Emily reined the horse in creating a prison of hooves around her uncle. She looked down at him, her eyes burning with a cold, fierce justice. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Governor Church stepped out of the carriage as the dust settled. He was a stern man, with a mustache that commanded respect and eyes that missed nothing. He walked straight past the cowering deputies to where Garrett was helping Sarah Martha and Grace stumble out of the smoke-filled cave. "Mr. Cole," the governor said, tipping his hat as if they were meeting in a parlor and not a war zone. "Your daughter here makes a compelling argument. She rode through the night to find us." Garrett blinked, his eyes stinging. He looked at Emily, who was sliding off the horse, her legs finally giving out as a soldier caught her. She's not my daughter." Garrett croaked the words thick in his throat. He looked at the girl who had risked everything for a man she had met in an auction house. "She's my partner. She told me everything," Church said, his voice hardening as he turned to look at the captives. "About the illegal sale, the threats, the corruption involving Judge Crane." The governor walked over to Sheriff Barton, who was shaking so hard his badge rattled. "Sheriff, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately pending a federal investigation into human trafficking and corruption." Then Church turned his gaze to Tobias Reed, who was being dragged to his feet by two burly sergeants. Tobias was covered in mud, his finery ruined. "And you," Church said, with distinctive disgust. "Buying and selling your own flesh and blood, attempting to burn them alive. There is a special place in hell for men like you, Mr. Reed, but I intend to let the territorial prison have you first." "It's my family," Tobias spat, struggling against the soldier's grip, his eyes wild. "I have rights. That man stole my property." Garrett stiffened. The adrenaline that had kept him going transformed instantly into a white-hot rage. He stepped forward, the exhausted slump vanishing from his shoulders. He walked toward Tobias, his hand dropping to the Colt on his hip. "You have the right to hang," Garrett growled. The soldiers stepped back, unsure if they should intervene. Garrett looked ready to end it right there. He wanted to. Every fiber of his being wanted to erase Tobias Reed from the earth. Suddenly a hand touched his chest. It was light trembling, but it stopped him like a stone wall. Sarah stood between them. Her face was blackened with soot, her dress singed, but her eyes were clear. "No," she said softly. "He tried to kill you," Garrett said, his voice shaking. "He sold you." "I know," Sarah whispered. She looked at Tobias, not with fear, but with pity. "But if you kill him now, you carry that weight forever. Don't let his blood stain this land. Don't let him turn you back into a killer." Garrett looked down at Sarah. He saw the fear he had caused in the saloon that first night, and he saw the trust she was offering him now. He looked at the gun in his hand, then back at Tobias. Slowly, painfully, Garrett lifted his hand away from his weapon. The rage cooled, replaced by something heavier, but cleaner. "Get him out of my sight," Garrett said to the soldiers, "before I change my mind." As the cavalry marched the prisoners away, Tobias looked back, screaming curses that faded into the wind, but no one was listening. The adrenaline finally crashed. Garrett dropped to his knees in the dirt, the exhaustion taking him. Immediately he felt small arms around his neck. Grace buried her face in his dusty coat, sobbing. Then Martha. Then Emily, limping over to join them. And finally Sarah. They huddled together on the blackened slope of Dead Man's Pass, a knot of survivors amidst the ruin. Garrett closed his eyes, and for the first time in 5 years he hugged them back. He held them tight, shielding them from the world, realizing that while he had fought to save their lives, they had just saved his soul. The trial of Tobias Reed and Judge Archibald Crane became the defining spectacle of the Dakota Territory in 1888. It was a sordid affair that exposed the rot beneath the polite society of the frontier. But for the sisters, the banging of the gavel didn't just signal a legal victory, it was the sound of chains breaking. When Tobias was dragged from the courtroom, screaming obscenities that no longer held the power to terrify Sarah, didn't look away. She squeezed Garrett's hand, feeling the calloused warmth of his palm, and finally exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for years. Tobias was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, a sentence he would not survive, but his shadow had already evaporated from their lives the moment they stepped out into the blinding, clean sunlight of the street. However, the true story didn't end with the closing of a prison cell. It began with the opening of a home. Garrett Cole returned to Iron Ridge, but the man who rode back through the timber archway was not the same ghost who had haunted it 5 years prior. The silence that had once suffocated the ranch was replaced by a chaotic, vibrant symphony of life. The main house, once a mausoleum, to grief now smelled of rising dough, fresh pine, and wood smoke. Winter turned to spring, and the change in the seasons mirrored the thaw in Garrett's own heart. He no longer ate quickly to escape the table. Instead, dinner became a sacred ritual, a time where the day's work was measured not in profit, but in shared stories. One evening, as a warm Chinook wind rattled the window panes, the family gathered around the heavy oak dining table. The plates had been cleared, leaving only the soft glow of the kerosene lamps. Garrett seemed restless. He stood up, walked to the sideboard, and retrieved a large roll of paper yellowed slightly at the edges and smelling of drafting ink. He cleared his throat, a sound that instantly drew the attention of all 4 sisters. "I've been doing some thinking." Garrett began, his voice gruff, but lacking its old edge. He unrolled the paper across the table, smoothing the corners with his large hands. About the future. About what this land is for. Sarah, Emily, Martha, and Grace leaned in. It was a blueprint, but it wasn't for a barn or a corral or a bunkhouse. It was a sprawling, ambitious structure featuring a grand main hall, rows of dormitory rooms, a vast library, and a dedicated hospital wing. It looked less like a ranch house and more like a university. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her finger tracing the delicate lines of the drawing. "I have too much land," Garrett said, looking at each of them in turn. "And too much money sitting in the bank doing no good. I've seen the way the world treats children who have no one, orphans, runaways, kids sold off like you were treated like livestock because they have no one to stand in front of them." He paused, his eyes finding the dark window where his own reflection stared back a man who had once been lost in that same darkness. I want to build a place for them. Here, on Iron Ridge, a place where they don't have to be afraid." He looked at Sarah, his gaze softening. "But a building is just wood and stone. I know cattle and I know guns. I don't know how to raise a child, let alone 100 of them. I can build the walls, but I can't build the home. I need you." The room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. "I want you to run it." Garrett continued, his voice firming up with conviction. "The Cole Reed Academy." He pointed to the different sections of the blueprint, assigning them not just as duties, but as destinies. "Martha," he said, looking at the 14-year-old, whose mind was sharper than any accountant in the territory. "You have the mind of a judge and the precision of an engineer. You'll manage the endowment. You'll make sure no one ever steals from us again. Emily," he turned to the wild-hearted teen, "you have the courage of a warrior and a gift with beasts that I've never seen equaled. You'll run the stables. You'll teach them that trust is earned, not broken. Grace." He smiled at the youngest, who was clutching the wooden wolf he had carved her. "You have the hope. You'll be the heart of the infirmary once you're old enough to study medicine." And Sarah. Garrett's voice dropped an octave. He looked at the woman who had walked into his kitchen and saved him with nothing more than an apple pie and stubborn kindness. "You have a heart that can forgive a monster. You are the foundation. You'll be the mother to them all." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. She looked at the blueprint, seeing not just lines on paper, but a future where their suffering could be transmuted into someone else's salvation. She reached out, picking up a pencil from the table. "Yes," she whispered, "we will do it. But not that name." With a trembling but determined hand, she drew a line through the Cole Reed Academy. "Tobias Reed doesn't get his name on this," she said fiercely. "And this isn't an academy. An academy is for learning facts. This is for healing." She wrote a new name in elegant looping script, the Four Sisters Sanctuary. Construction began the following spring breaking ground as the wildflowers bloomed across the valley. It was the largest building project the territory had ever seen, employing half the town of Deadwood. Garrett spent his entire fortune on it, without flinching, importing glass from Chicago and slate from the east. Iron Ridge ceased to be a cattle ranch. It became a fortress of kindness, and history records the results of what they built. Martha Reed went on to defy every convention of the West. She became one of the first female certified accountants in the region. Her management of the sanctuary's endowment was so shrewd and forward-thinking that even when the Great Depression ravaged the country decades later, the sanctuary never turned away a single child. Emily Reed became a legend in her own right. She developed a revolutionary program where troubled, angry children, boys and girls who had been beaten down by the world, were paired with wild horses. She taught them that to tame a horse, you had to master yourself first. She never married, claiming no man could keep pace with her, but she was the beloved aunt to hundreds of rugged souls who credited her with saving their lives. Grace Reed fulfilled the promise of her youth. She traveled east to study facing ridicule and barriers, but returned as Dr. Grace Reed. She ran the hospital wing of the sanctuary, saving thousands of lives during the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, working until she dropped from exhaustion, fueled by the memory of a man who once carved her a wooden wolf to keep her safe. And Sarah. Sarah remained the anchor. She and Garrett never had a grand public wedding. They didn't need the spectacle. One quiet autumn afternoon, they simply stood before the local preacher in the sanctuary's newly built chapel with the sisters and 50 orphans as witnesses and made promises to one another. They say that Garrett Cole, the man once known as the Devil of Iron Ridge, smiled every day for the rest of his life. He softened not into weakness, but into peace. 10 years after that fateful auction, a journalist from a prestigious New York newspaper traveled all the way to the Dakota Territory. He had heard rumors of the castle in the west and wanted to interview the recluse who built it. He found the sanctuary bustling with 200 children running, laughing, learning, and living. He found Garrett sitting on the wide front porch, watching a group of boys playing tag near the garden where Sarah was teaching a reading class. Garrett's hair was silver now, but his back was as straight as ever. "Mr. Cole," the journalist asked, notebook in hand. "The records show you paid $5,000 for 4 girls in a saloon auction. That was a king's ransom in those days, a fortune wasted on domestic help, as some called it. Looking at all this, the cost, the effort, did you ever regret the investment?" Garrett looked out at the valley. He watched Emily galloping across the lower pasture with a trail of students behind her. He saw Martha through the office window, commanding a room full of bankers. He saw Sarah, her face turned up to the sun, laughing at something a child had said. He turned to the journalist, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It wasn't an investment," Garrett said, his voice rumbling with the weight of absolute truth. "It was a ransom for my own soul, and it was the cheapest bargain I ever made." The legend of Iron Ridge stands as a testament to the fact that blood doesn't make a family love, and loyalty do. Garrett Cole thought he was saving 4 sisters, but in reality they saved him. They took a broken man and gave him a purpose that outlived them all. Today, the site of the sanctuary is a historical landmark, a reminder that even in the harshest Wild West, compassion was the strongest weapon of all. Enjoyed this story? If this tale of justice and redemption touched your heart, please like the video and share it with a friend who loves a happy ending. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story from the frontier. Let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Garrett's shoes? Thanks for watching.